There's a phrase that keeps coming back whenever Britain faces a new crisis in the Middle East, and it's not a policy slogan or a diplomatic catchline. It's a memory. Iraq. More than 20 years after the UK joined the US-led invasion in 2003, that decision still hangs over British politics like unfinished business. And this week, with tensions flaring after US-Israeli strikes on Iran, that shadow showed up again in the clearest possible way. Keir Starmer stood in the House of Commons and basically told the country and the world, we are not forgetting what happened last time. Starmer's message was carefully balanced, but the core of it was simple. He was warning against repeating past mistakes, while also trying to reassure MPs and the public that the government is thinking before acting. In the Commons, he pointed back to the defining trauma from modern Labour foreign policy and made it explicit. This government remembers what Iraq cost. And for Labour, that cost wasn't abstract. Iraq wasn't just a military decision that went wrong. It shattered trust in government, tore through the party, and left a moral wound that never really healed. You can trace its influence through later moments, too. When Ed Miliband, as Labour leader, refused to back military action in Syria in 2013, plenty of people saw that as Iraq speaking through a different decision, not because Syria and Iraq were the same situation, but because a political and ethical hangover from 2003 was still shaping what MPs were willing to vote for. Now Starmer is dealing with his own version of that dilemma. The immediate situation is the escalating conflict involving Israel, the United States, and Iran, and it puts the UK in an awkward, familiar position. Britain is a close U.S. ally, but also a country that knows what it looks like to get pulled into military action that starts with a clear objective and ends with years of instability. At first, the UK drew a firmer line. The government reportedly refused to let the U.S. use British military bases for any strikes that could be linked to regime change. The reason wasn't just politics, it was law. Legal advice inside government suggested that kind of involvement could cross the line into something incompatible with international law. And Starmer made the principle sound unambiguous when he told Parliament that this government doesn't believe in overthrowing governments through airstrikes. But foreign policy rarely stays neat for long. As Iranian missile and drone attacks spread across the region, fears grew about British citizens and British forces. And once the threat is framed that way, as immediate danger rather than distant strategy, the pressure to act changes fast. So Britain's position shifted. The government agreed that U.S. forces could use UK bases, but only within very tight limits, described as specific and limited defensive purposes. That wording matters. It's the difference between saying we're joining a campaign and saying we're helping prevent harm in the here and now. Officials also try to explain why defensive can still involve striking targets. The argument goes like this. Once missiles are in the air, stopping them is incredibly hard. If you want to protect people effectively, you may need to hit the places the missiles are coming from. One official put it in a memorable way. Rather than trying to intercept the arrow, you go after the archer. Even with that logic, Starmer has been determined to underline what Britain will not do. He told MPs that the UK was involved in the initial strikes on Iran and that Britain won't join offensive action now. Instead, he framed the UK role around protecting British lives and backing allies who, in the government's view, are acting under collective self-defense. And this is where the Iraq lesson becomes more than a talking point. The central fear left by 2003 isn't just that a war can be morally questionable or politically poisonous. It's that even when the early phase looks successful, the aftermath can be disastrous. Iraq's opening assault, the so-called shock and awe, moved quickly. What came next dragged on. Instability, insurgency, and a long period with destruction of an old order created space for chaos rather than peace. That's the deeper anxiety now. Some reports suggest officials in Whitehall are worried about what comes after these strikes on Iran. Is there a plan? Is there an end state? Or is military action happening faster than the strategy needed to contain the consequences? If Washington doesn't have clarity on what happens next, the region could face a new strategic vacuum. And once those vacuums open up, they can shape politics and violence for years. So Starmer is walking a narrow path. On one side is a reality of the UK's alliance with the United States, and the expectation that Britain won't simply stand aside when a major partner is in conflict. On the other side is a hard-earned awareness that getting drawn into an open-ended Middle East confrontation can define a government and damage trust at home for a generation. For a Labor prime minister, the political stakes are even sharper. Iraq isn't just a chapter in a textbook for Labor. It's a scar. It's the example that opponents raise, that voters remember, and that Labor MPs carry into every debate about intervention. Decisions made in a crisis can outlive the crisis itself, shaping reputations long after the headlines have moved on. That's why, when Starmer invokes Iraq in the Commons, he isn't doing it for historical color. He's signaling that the government sees the danger of mission creep, the danger of unclear objectives, and the danger of mistaking the first stage of a conflict for the whole story. In other words, Iraq isn't just history in this moment. It's a warning Britain is still trying to take seriously